Well, hello everyone and welcome to this webinar about Deutsche Bank's funding for the Australian coal mining corporation, Whitehaven Coal. My name is Christian Slattery. I'm a campaigner at Market Forces. I'm speaking to you from Bunurong country on Phillip Island, Victoria, and I pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past and present. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar. Market Forces is an environmental advocacy organisation with staff in Australia and around the world that exposes financial institutions funding environmentally destructive projects. I'm joined by one very special guest today who you'll be hearing from later in the program, and that is George Woods, the National Coordinator of Lock the Gate. Tonight, we'll be looking into the financing Deutsche Bank is reportedly arranging for Whitehaven Coal, one of Australia's most controversial and polluting coal companies. And we believe that in order to remain consistent with its own climate policies, and because of Whitehaven's highly destructive activities, Deutsche Bank must do no further work with this coal mining company. We'll be exploring Whitehaven's plans to build 3 new or expanded coal mines that could double the company's coal production by 2030 and unleash billions of tonnes of carbon emissions. These mines are totally inconsistent with global goals of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees and achieving net zero emissions by 2050. You'll also hear tonight from George Woods about Whitehaven's legacy of environmental destruction, community division, and law breaking. Finally, I'll examine how Deutsche Bank's reported support for Whitehaven stands in conflict with its stated support for the Paris Agreement and support for achieving net zero emissions by 2050. We'll also explore in detail how Deutsche Bank could be in breach of its own policy on thermal coal by arranging funds for Whitehaven. These issues are enormous reputational risks for Deutsche Bank, and they underscore why it is essential for the bank to rule out funding for companies like Whitehaven that are expanding the coal industry. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end of this webinar, so please type any questions you might have into the chat box. We'll do our best to answer them after the presentations. And a reminder that a recording of this webinar and a fully referenced slide deck will be made available online. I'd also now like to take this opportunity to invite you to complete the anonymous staff survey form that we've attached to this webinar. If you're a staff member of Deutsche Bank, filling out this survey is one of the most important steps you can take to support this campaign. A link to the survey will be posted in the chat and it'll be made available on the RSVP page for the webinar. The reference point for tonight's webinar is the bond deal Deutsche Bank is reportedly arranging for Whitehaven. And that bond deal was first reported by financial news source Debtwire in September last year. The article cited industry insiders confirming that Deutsche Bank organised a non-deal roadshow event and intends to act as a bookrunner for any bond issue that emerges. Subsequent media coverage of the bond deal has highlighted that the company could seek to raise around AU $500 million through this bond issue. The bond deal is far from Deutsche Bank's first involvement with Whitehaven. The bank first loaned to Whitehaven in 2013 and most recently contributed $30 million to Whitehaven's 2020 lending syndicate. So you may be asking, who is Whitehaven Coal and why does it matter that Deutsche Bank is potentially arranging finance for this company? Whitehaven is the biggest pure-play coal mining company on the Australian share market and one of the most controversial resources companies in the country. Since first being publicly listed on the Australian Securities Exchange in 2007, the company has derived 100% of its revenue from the sale of coal. Now, as I'll outline shortly, Whitehaven is planning 3 new or expanded coal mines that could more than double the company's production by 2030. Whitehaven, as you can see, currently operates 4 mines in the Australian state of New South Wales. The company's major operations are the Maules Creek and Narrabri coal mines. Whitehaven's Maules Creek coal mine is one of the most contested coal mines in Australian history. The mine's construction attracted a 2-year blockade to protect the Lerd State Forest, an area home to thousands of hectares of threatened species habitat. The Maules Creek campaign also attracted support from thousands of Australians and environmental advocacy groups, and it was fiercely opposed by Gomeroi First Nations people. Whitehaven's Maules Creek coal mine is licensed to operate until the mid-2050s, decades beyond the point at which coal must be phased out. Meanwhile, the Narrabri coal mine is licensed to produce 11 million tonnes of coal per annum until 2031. And Whitehaven is seeking an extension to the Narrabri mine that would permit thermal coal extraction until 2044. In the 2021 financial year, Whitehaven produced almost 14 million tonnes of coal from its mines. 84% of Whitehaven's revenue was produced from thermal coal in FY21, and that's consistent with the company's production levels for the last 5 years. Combined, Whitehaven's existing mines have around 500 million tonnes of coal, which could release over 1 billion tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions. Whitehaven is proposing 3 new or expanded coal mines via the Narrabri expansion and the Greenfield, Vickery and Winchester South coal mines. Combined, these 3 new and expanded mines have marketable coal reserves of almost 500 million tonnes. Whitehaven's proposed new or expanded mines would substantially expand the company's coal production over the next 30 years. In the last decade, Whitehaven has more than doubled its production, and at the company's 2021 AGM, Whitehaven's CEO confirmed the company could more than double its coal production again by 2030 through these 3 new coal projects. What you see on your screen right now is a chart that we've produced from Whitehaven's own data showing the company's historical and projected production from 2020 to 2050. In the black and grey is production from Whitehaven's operating coal mines, and the orange and yellow show production at the company's proposed new or expanded mines. This next chart compares Whitehaven's planned production with the orange line to coal production under 1.5 degree and net zero by 2050 coal supply scenarios. So those are the green and blue lines. Whitehaven's current plans would involve a doubling of coal production by 2030, and as you can see, sustained high production through to 2040, which is in stark contrast to the International Energy Agency's net zero by 2050 scenario and the Production Gap Report's 1.5 degree scenario, which model global coal production falling by over 50% by 2030 and around 80% by 2040. Projected out to 2050, cumulative Scope 3 emissions from Whitehaven's existing and new mines are over 2 billion tonnes CO2 equivalent. Around 60% of these emissions, or about 1.3 billion tonnes, derive from new or expanded mines. The combined emissions from Whitehaven's mines are equivalent to Europe's biggest coal power plant, the Bełchatów coal power station in Poland, running for 57 years. Whitehaven's plans to expand coal production are radically out of step with what is required to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, a Paris Agreement goal Deutsche Bank claims to support. In order to limit global warming to this goal, numerous publications point to the need for an immediate halt to new coal mines and expansions, and for global coal production and use to rapidly shrink. In releasing the latest IPCC report, United Nations Secretary Antonio Guterres was abundantly clear that investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure is moral and economic madness. Whitehaven's business plans are also not compatible with achieving net zero emissions by 2050, another goal that Deutsche Bank claims to support. The IEA's net zero emissions by 2050 scenario lays bare the rapid decline of the coal industry that is required to achieve this goal. The IEA scenario is crystal clear that achieving net zero emissions by 2050 means no new coal mines or mine extensions are required. And specifically, the IEA state that, quote, no new coal mines or extensions of existing ones are needed in the net zero emissions by 2050 scenario as coal demand declines precipitously. With that summary of Whitehaven's coal expansion plans complete, I'd now like to introduce you to George Woods, the National Coordinator of Lock the Gate. As a Hunter Valley local, George will give you a sense of just how toxic Whitehaven's existing operations have been to the local environment and community, and also examine the company's legacy of environmental law breaches. So I'll just stop sharing my screen and hand you over to George Woods.
Thanks very much, Christian. And thank you, all of you, for joining the webinar and for your interest in Whitehaven coal and its impact on the environment and local communities in New South Wales. I am speaking to you from Warramai country in Newcastle on the coast of New South Wales at Port City. And the country that we're talking about where Whitehaven operates the 4 coal mines that Christian listed for you is Gomeroi country in the northwest of New South Wales. Lock the Gate is a national network of community groups and individuals who are concerned about the impacts of coal mining and unconventional gas. We bring together landholders, farmers, traditional owners, townspeople, conservationists who are united in their concern for the landscape, the water, cultural heritage, and the social fabric of local communities, which are all badly affected by the mining industry in Australia. Lock the Gate in New South Wales works with local communities who are affected by the impacts of the 4 coal mines operated by Whitehaven that Christian outlined, as well as the communities who are going to be impacted by the expansion projects that he described. In the last decade, at those 4 operating coal mines in New South Wales, Whitehaven Coal has been found guilty or investigated for breaches of particularly its environmental conditions at those 4 mines on 35 separate occasions, and many of those included multiple offences in the same occasion. They've been prosecuted numerous times by government agencies in New South Wales for those breaches and have incurred very close to $1.5 million in penalties for environmental law breaking to date. Several of those prosecutions have occurred in the last 12 months, one for illegal land clearing, another for the stealing, essentially, of water, one for pollution of a local creek where polystyrene balls that are used as part of the explosives process at the Maules Creek mine escaped into the environment and down into a local creek. And those prosecutions were undertaken by 3 different government agencies. So the operations of Whitehaven come to the attention of multiple different regulatory actors in New South Wales. The EPA, which monitors and enforces pollution laws, the resources regulator, which looks after mining titles and exploration activities, and the natural resources access regulator, which is responsible for water law and regulation in New South Wales. At one point, 3 years ago, the New South Wales Environment Protection Agency actually escalated its risk rating of Whitehaven because of these ongoing problems of the environmental management of its mining operations. I might just go into some detail about the water theft story at Maules Creek, because for us it really does speak to the company's reckless disregard of environmental law in New South Wales and the impact that their activities have on the local community surrounding them. So the area where Whitehaven's 4 mines operate is called the Namoi Valley. And 5 years ago, that region was in its worst drought on record. Farmers in the area were running out of water, they were destocking, they were losing ground cover and groundwater. The impact was really very substantial on the agricultural industry. And the Maules Creek coal mine as well was also short of water. The mine does have a high security license to the Namoi River, but the Namoi itself was dry at that time and not running. So faced with this situation, which although unprecedented, really ought to have been foreseen, because we know we are a land of drought in Australia, but also we've known for some decades that the effects of climate change will dramatically alter rainfall patterns in that area. But faced with the situation of running out of water, Whitehaven, instead of following the condition of their mining approval, which says that if they don't have enough water to run the mine, they have to adjust their operations to match the available water, they instead broke several of their environmental conditions and broke the water law in New South Wales. Firstly, the mine constructed illegal dams to capture clean water from the upper catchment beyond the mine, above the mine, and took and used that water without a license to run the mine. And it was about 3 billion litres of water over 3 years that they stole. And that water should have been running into the local environment, which was already under extreme stress because of the drought conditions. And secondly, the mine then bought up nearby farms surrounding the mine site and proceeded to build 2 unapproved illegal pipelines to transport water from those farms that had previously been dedicated to irrigation to the mine site to run the mine with. And they were fined by the Department of Planning for doing that. And they were prosecuted by the Natural Resources Access Regulator for stealing that water without a licence. And I tell this story really because it was a situation that caused a great deal of stress to the farming community that lives alongside the Maules Creek coal mine, and really speaks to the company's disregard for the environmental consequences of their actions and their irresponsible neighbourly, I suppose, conduct in the Namoi Valley. And it is unsurprising, given their litany of environmental failures, that a recent survey of local people conducted by Whitehaven for the assessment of the Narrabri underground expansion that Christian mentioned found very high levels of distrust and unhappiness among the people who have the most contact with the mining company, with Whitehaven Coal, in the Namoi Valley area where those mines are located. The survey found that around 95% of local respondents disagreed or strongly disagreed that Whitehaven was a good neighbour. 90% disagreed or strongly disagreed that Whitehaven listens to and responds to community concerns. 82% of locals disagreed or strongly disagreed that Whitehaven contributes to the community and cares about the region. And these are pretty stark numbers, and they certainly reflect what we know of the community sentiment of the people who are most intimate and most closely associated with and affected by those mining operations. In that survey, most of the respondents from the wider district disagreed that their natural and conservation areas were protected and well maintained, disagreed that local culture and heritage values were respected, disagreed that they were confident about their future, or that appropriate housing was affordable and available for most people, and that community opinion was being considered in decision-making about major projects like mines. And I raise this really because Whitehaven, makes the claim that it is a contributor to the local community through the employment that it provides at the mines, which of course is true for the people who work there. But the broader sentiment in the community is that there is the operation of the mines is making housing unaffordable, is making the labour market tight, and is coming at the detriment of the social and environmental values of the area that they cherish. And so those are statistics, but I also I suppose, wanted to add something a little more personal to that, because I've been at the public hearings where local farmers have been in tears about the impact that they expect the Whitehaven Vickery project to inflict on their farms and their community. And I have also spoken with local farmers distressed at being followed around on their local roads by security agents hired by Whitehaven because of the sustained protests against the Maules Creek coal mine when it was under construction. And I've worked with traditional owners who've had requests for access and protection of their cultural heritage sites denied and rejected by Whitehaven Coal. And so the impact that the Whitehaven mines and the attitude of the company is having on the local community is very profound and very acute. And I would say widespread across the community where they are operating. And I just thought I would end really by talking about climate change, because it's an issue that is of great concern to the people in the local area and is having an impact on the environment and the community in the Namoi Valley. And as Christian's presentation showed, Whitehaven Coal's business is fundamentally incompatible with global efforts to prevent catastrophic climate change. The company's sustainability report claims that Whitehaven recognises and supports the long-term goal of the Paris Agreement to limit global average warming to below 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels, but that is not borne out by their actions or the rest of the sustainability report. They rely on the International Energy Agency's stated policy scenario to underpin their business strategy. And in other words, they're absolutely counting on the world failing to prevent 2 degrees of global warming as part of their strategy. They admit that under the IEA's alternative sustainable development scenario, global average thermal coal demand is going to contract by 7.3% compounded annually for the next 2 decades. But they argue that Australia will see a lesser decline than that global average without actually specifying what that decline is going to be. Unlike other mining companies, they have no Scope 3 emissions caps or reduction targets and no business strategy to meet their purported stated commitment to the Paris Agreement goals. It seems to me that really they're relying on investors not diligently attending to the difference between cheap promises and their actual business strategy, not diligently asking them to show how that business strategy can possibly be compatible with 7.3% contraction in thermal coal use year on year in the coming 2 decades. And it really is of a piece with the contempt that Whitehaven Coal shows for environmental law and sustainability across its operations. And I'm just really pleased that you have shown interest in finding out more about the way this company conducts itself locally and globally in Australia and around the world. Thanks, Christian.
Thanks very much, George. Look, I'll just share my screen for the final section of this presentation. So in the final section of this presentation, I'm going to look at Deutsche Bank's stated position on climate change targets and coal mining and show how the bank's actions are not meeting its rhetoric. Deutsche Bank claims to support the goals of the Paris Agreement and of achieving net zero emissions by 2050. In 2015, the bank signed the Paris Pledge for Action, and in 2021, it joined the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And Deutsche Bank's CEO, Christian Sewing, has made some very strong statements about sustainability, including, and I quote, "The fight against climate change is probably the greatest challenge facing humanity, and we banks will have to fundamentally align ourselves with it." Those are really strong words, and the sentiment is admirable, but these statements are completely meaningless if Deutsche Bank continues to finance fossil fuel companies like Whitehaven Coal. And again, to quote from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who said recently, "Some government and business leaders are saying one thing but doing another. Simply put, they are lying." So the question for Deutsche Bank is whether it means what it says when it claims to support strong climate action. As I've demonstrated, as George has demonstrated, Whitehaven's coal production plans are completely inconsistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees and achieving net zero emissions by 2050. I want to turn now to Deutsche Bank's environmental and social policy framework, which spells out the bank's commitments to lending to the coal mining sector. The policy was updated in July 2020, which was after Deutsche Bank loaned to Whitehaven Coal in February 2020, but it was well before the bond roadshow was announced in late 2021. The policy states, as you can see on the screen, that any transaction in coal mining requires enhanced ES review and potentially discussion within a regional reputational risk committee. In addition, we will not provide any financing for greenfield thermal coal mining. We will not finance new greenfield coal-related infrastructure, regardless if related to new or existing mines. In 2016, we committed to reducing our coal lending exposure and set a 3-year reduction target of 20%. Per end of 2019, we achieved that target and now further commit to phase out coal exposure by 2025 worldwide, including both lending and capital markets. Deutsche Bank's funding for Whitehaven potentially places it in breach of its obligations under this policy. Specifically, Deutsche Bank states we will not provide any financing for greenfield thermal coal mining. Now, Deutsche Bank has clarified online that this policy includes direct and indirect finance. Whitehaven is developing 2 greenfield coal projects, the Vickery and Winchester South mines, that would increase thermal coal production. And despite being marketed by the company as metallurgical coal mines, the technical documentation for these projects produced by Whitehaven state they will produce a minimum of 40% thermal coal. The Vickery and Winchester South mines could therefore not only substantially increase thermal coal production, but they could well, in fact, turn out to be majority thermal coal operations. If a single dollar of finance arranged by Deutsche Bank flows to these projects, in our view, that would constitute a technical breach of Deutsche Bank's policy. At a higher level, Deutsche Bank's financial support for Whitehaven is a clear breach of the spirit of the thermal coal policy, and it seriously undercuts Deutsche Bank's claims to be exiting thermal coal mining by 2025. It also undercuts the bank's stated commitments to the Paris Agreement and to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. For Deutsche Bank to have any credibility on these issues, it must stop financing companies that are expanding the coal industry, like Whitehaven Coal. Failing to do so exposes the bank to significant reputational risks and potentially risks a breach of company policy. If you're a staff member at Deutsche Bank, I would urge you to raise these concerns with your management. You can see there another statement from Deutsche Bank online about its policy. That brings me to the end of my presentation for this evening. And before moving to questions, which can be submitted through the chat Q&A function on your Zoom browser, I'd like to again invite you to complete the anonymous survey form that we've attached to this webinar in the chat. And also will be available on the RSVP page online. If you're a staff member of Deutsche Bank, filling out this survey is the most important step you can take to support this campaign. And we'll be making the link to the survey readily available for you. Okay, so moving to questions. Thanks to everyone who has submitted a question. The first one that I can see on my screen is, Deutsche Bank has a lot of customers in fossil fuel industries. You are suggesting the bank should simply drop these customers instead of supporting them through the energy transition. Why isn't it better for Deutsche Bank to stay engaged with companies like Whitehaven and encourage them to shift their business practices to something more sustainable? Well, firstly, thank you for the question. The simple answer is that Whitehaven has demonstrated absolutely no intention to align its business activities with the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees or achieving net zero emissions by 2050. As I've already stated in this presentation, developing 3 new or expanded coal mines and doubling coal production by 2030 is at complete odds with these climate goals. There have been a lot of attempts by investors over many years to engage with Whitehaven, but absolutely nothing those investors have done has shaken the company's determination to pursue new coal projects. And there is absolutely no evidence that an engagement strategy is or would be effective. So in these circumstances, the best contribution that Deutsche Bank can make to the energy transition is to ensure it stops financing companies with business plans standing in contradiction to the energy transition that is required to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. The next question that we have is, what evidence do you have that this bond deal is even happening? Again, thank you very much for the question. As I referred to earlier in my presentation, the bond deal and Deutsche Bank's involvement in it was first reported by financial news service Debtwire in September 2021. And subsequent interviews conducted by Whitehaven's chief financial officer have confirmed that Whitehaven is looking to place a bond later in 2022. And the company has been abundantly transparent about this in its financial presentations. Market Forces has written to Deutsche Bank several times about this bond deal, seeking clarification about the bank's involvement, but we are yet to receive a response. And frankly, until Deutsche Bank clarifies its role in this deal, the issue will continue to be one of significant reputational risk to the bank. The next question is, you say that there might be a breach of Deutsche Bank's policy, but can't Deutsche Bank quarantine the funds to ensure they are not used at Whitehaven's greenfield thermal coal mines? I would say in response to that it might be a nice solution in theory, but in practice, what it means is Whitehaven has more funds available in its business to spend on new coal mining projects. So ring fencing finance for existing mines just frees up capital elsewhere in Whitehaven's business to be allocated towards new thermal coal production plans. The only way to ensure Deutsche Bank's financial support does not contribute to new thermal coal production is to not provide it at all. Okay, so the final question that we have tonight is, wouldn't arranging a sustainability-linked bond be a good contribution to the energy transition? Well, Whitehaven is a pure play coal mining company. Their new and expanded mines are completely in contradiction of what is required to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees and achieve net zero by 2050. And while those plans remain on the books, there is no credible financial support that can be provided to Whitehaven in a way that is aligned with the Paris Agreement and net zero by 2050. And Deutsche Bank should have nothing to do with Whitehaven and its disastrous plans to expand the coal industry whilst those plans remain on the books. So those are all of the questions that we have tonight that have been submitted. On behalf of, so that brings us to the end of our presentation. On behalf of Market Forces, I'd like to thank everyone for their attendance. I'd like to thank George from Lock the Gate for her attendance. And I'd also like to remind you again, please, to complete the survey form that's been put into the chat and also available on our RSVP page. Thank you all again for your attendance and have a wonderful day.